I stood in the grand living room of Glenn's parents' house, my hands slightly trembling. The atmosphere was heavy with judgment, and I could feel their eyes scanning me, measuring my worth before I even spoke. His mother, Debbie, sat with perfect posture, her cold gaze fixed on me. "Which university did you graduate from?" she asked, her tone sharp. I had expected this question, but it still made my heart pound. Taking a deep breath, I answered honestly, "I didn't go to university. I attended a vocational school to become a pastry chef." A heavy silence followed. His father, Jake, raised an eyebrow before letting out a scoff. "A pastry chef? That doesn't seem like a real career." His words stung, but I refused to show it. I wasn't here to impress them with fancy degrees. I was here because I loved their son. Debbie exchanged a glance with Jake before leaning forward, her voice laced with suspicion. "And your family? What do they do?" I knew exactly what she was trying to figure out. Was I from a wealthy background? Did I have the right kind of family? I met her gaze and answered firmly. "My mother passed away when I was little. My father raised me on his own." A flicker of something passed over Debbie's face. Disapproval, pity, or perhaps both. She sighed, as if my background alone had sealed my fate in her mind. "A single-parent home," she muttered under her breath. I could see it so clearly now. They had already judged me before I had even walked through their door. Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if he had figured me out completely. "You must be after our money." His words hit me like a slap. How could he think that? Did he truly believe I had spent years working hard just to trick my way into their wealthy family? I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I held back my frustration. "That's not true," I said firmly. "I love Glenn for who he is, not for what he has." But my words had no effect. Debbie crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Glenn, you're being deceived," she said coldly. I could feel Glenn tensing beside me. "Mom, stop it. You're wrong," he said, his voice controlled but firm. He reached for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze, but his parents' expressions didn't change. They had already made up their minds about me. I knew Glenn had struggled under his parents' control for years. They had dictated every part of his life, where he studied, the friends he made, even his career path. And now, they wanted to control his marriage too. But Glenn wasn't a child anymore. He had spent his whole life following their rules, but today, he was drawing the line. "I won't let you talk to Olive like this," he said, his voice steady. "I love her, and I will marry her." Debbie's face twisted in disbelief. "Glenn, you don't understand what you're doing," she said sharply. But for the first time, Glenn wasn't listening to them. He was standing up for what he wanted. I wasn't going to stand there and let them belittle me any longer. If they wanted to judge me, they needed to know exactly who I was. "If you're so curious about my background," I said with a smile, keeping my voice calm, "let me introduce you to my father." Glenn's parents exchanged smug looks, as if they were expecting me to call someone insignificant. "Oh? And who is he?" Debbie asked, tilting her head. Without another word, I pulled out my phone and dialed my father's number. Glenn's parents watched me with mild amusement, clearly believing that whoever walked through that door wouldn't change their opinion. But they were in for a surprise. An hour later, my father arrived. As soon as he stepped inside, the entire mood of the room shifted. Glenn's parents' faces drained of color. Jake's jaw dropped, and for the first time since I arrived, Debbie looked nervous. "Mr. Adams?" Jake stammered, his voice unsteady. My father offered a polite smile. "It's been a long time, Jake," he said smoothly. Glenn turned to me in shock. "Wait, you know each other?" he whispered. I nodded. "My father is a major investor in the interior design industry. Peterson Design, your parents' company, exists because of his financial support." Glenn's parents looked like they had just seen a ghost. They had assumed I was from a poor family, but the truth was the opposite. Without my father, their company wouldn't even be standing. Jake swallowed hard, suddenly unable to maintain his arrogant attitude. We didn't realize, Debbie murmured. My father didn't break his calm demeanor. You assumed my daughter was beneath you. You insulted her profession, judged her family, and accused her of being after your wealth. But Olive has never needed your money. She was raised with love, respect, and independence. Glenn squeezed my hand, his pride in me evident. I told you, he said, his voice steady. She's the best person I've ever met. Jake tried to backtrack. Of course we approve of the marriage, he said quickly. But we all knew the truth. They weren't approving because they had a change of heart. They were afraid. My father wasn't finished. I am withdrawing my support from Peterson Design, he announced. The color drained from Jake's face. No, please reconsider, he begged. Debbie's hands trembled as she spoke. We regret everything we said. We truly approve of Olive now. But I saw through them. They didn't respect me. They were only afraid of losing their fortune. Glenn took a step forward. You're only saying this because you're desperate, not because you care about us, he said. His voice was calm but full of determination. That's why I'm done. I'm cutting ties with you both. Debbie gasped. Glenn, you don't mean that, she cried, tears welling in her eyes. But Glenn didn't flinch. I spent my whole life doing what you wanted, but love isn't something you get to control, he said firmly. Tears streamed down Debbie's face, but for the first time Glenn wasn't swayed. I want a life with Olive, and if that means walking away from you, then I will. Jake slumped in his chair, defeated. Glenn had made his choice, and it wasn't them. As we walked out of Glenn's parents' house, I could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He took a deep breath, letting out a long sigh as if he had been holding it in for years. Are you okay? I asked, squeezing his hand gently. He nodded, his expression calm but firm. For the first time in my life, I feel free. My father, who had remained steady throughout the confrontation, placed a reassuring hand on Glenn's shoulder. You have nothing to regret, he said. You chose love over control, and that's something to be proud of. Glenn gave him a small smile, one filled with gratitude. He had lost his parents that day, but in return, he had gained something much more valuable, a family that truly loved and accepted him for who he was. And to him, that was more than enough. The days that followed were peaceful, but Glenn's parents didn't give up so easily. They called him endlessly, leaving messages begging for him to reconsider. Debbie's voice was full of desperation, her tone a mixture of regret and pleading. Glenn, please. We were wrong. We didn't mean any of it. Just come back, we'll fix everything, one of the messages said. But Glenn had already made up his mind. He didn't respond. Instead, he blocked their numbers and focused on moving forward with me. Meanwhile, Peterson Design began to fall apart. Without my father's financial support, their investors started pulling out one by one. Contracts were canceled, employees began quitting, and soon the company that once stood so proudly was now on the brink of collapse. Jake and Debbie had spent years looking down on others, thinking they were superior. But now, they were learning what it felt like to be powerless. As the months passed, Glenn and I moved forward with our wedding plans. Unlike his parents, my father stood beside us every step of the way. You two deserve happiness, he said one evening, handing us a check. I want you to have the wedding of your dreams. I hesitated at first, but he smiled. This isn't charity. This is a father giving his daughter the best start in her new life. Tears welled in my eyes as I hugged him tightly. Glenn placed his hand on my back, whispering, Your father is amazing. The wedding was everything we had ever hoped for. Small, but filled with warmth, love, and the people who truly cared about us. As I stood at the altar, looking into Glenn's eyes, I knew we had made the right decision. We had built our future on love, not wealth or social status. And that was all that truly mattered. After the wedding, Glenn continued to grow in his career. He became a respected attorney, fighting for people who had been wronged, just like he once had been. I continued working as a pastry chef, creating desserts that made people smile. Our life was simple but fulfilling. Every evening, we would sit together, talk about our day, and feel grateful for what we had built. Glenn never looked back. His parents had chosen their pride over their son, and in the end, they lost everything. Word spread that Peterson Design had officially gone bankrupt. Their desperate attempts to rebuild had failed, and investors had completely lost trust in them. Debbie, once the proud, controlling mother, rarely left the house anymore. She had spent years believing that money was power, but now she had nothing left, not even her own son. One day, Glenn received a letter in the mail. It was from his mother. He hesitated before opening it, his hands shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He nodded, but I could see the emotions flickering in his eyes as he unfolded the paper. The letter was an apology, one that felt real. Debbie admitted that she had let her pride blind her, that she had been wrong to judge me, and that she regretted every cruel thing she had said. She wrote about how empty the house felt without him, how she wished she could take it all back. Glenn read the letter in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finally set it down, he sighed. "I think she really means it," he said quietly. But after a moment, he folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer. "She needs to let go," he said firmly, "just like I have." Glenn had made his peace with the past. He didn't hold hatred in his heart, but he also knew that forgiveness didn't mean going back to a toxic relationship. "She regrets it because she lost everything," he murmured one evening as we sat on our porch. But regret isn't the same as change. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've done what's best for you," I reassured him. He nodded. "I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to move forward with you." And that's exactly what we did. We focused on the life we had built, the love we shared, and the future ahead of us. Glenn had broken free from his parents' control, and with that, he had finally found happiness. One evening, as the sun set in golden hues over our small home, Glenn turned to me with a soft smile. "No regrets?" he asked. I smiled back, leaning my head on his shoulder. None. The past no longer haunted us. We had built a life together, away from judgment, away from control, away from people who thought they had the right to dictate our future. And as we sat there, hand in hand, we both knew we had won. Not through revenge, not through power, but by choosing love, happiness, and each other. And in the end, that was the greatest